I'm Kim Zupan. I'll be reading from my novel, The Ploughmen. This is a story about an old criminal and a young deputy sheriff in Montana, out west in the U.S. A relationship that develops as they speak between the bars, largely late at night, and ends rather bloodily and tragically and bittersweet after the old man escapes and bad things ensue. This is from the beginning of the book. From where he sat, the old man could see the river, the whitecaps, and the pitching gulls, indistinguishable, and he could see the tallest buildings of the old smelter works beyond the coulee's steep flanks, and in the east the shadowed Missouri breaks, raggedly diminishing into the hazy blue gloaming of coming spring. He could feel the last of the winter in the wind, see it in the color of the river, gray and churning like molten lead. The soil there was poor and sandy, and the grass on these slopes grew sporadically and reminded him of pig's hair. There was yucca and prickly pear, and he could hear the faint voice in his ear, the hiss of blowing soil at the ridge crest. Still a farmer, he thought. He sifted the dirt through his fingers. The slope below was nearly bare and troughed by the melt-off of a million springtimes. Still a goddamn farmer. Seed put down here would most likely just wash away. Scattered about lay cobbles of sandstone, spalls of shale like medieval roof tiles randomly shingling the slanted ground. A gull came near enough that above the wind and the sea spray hiss, he could hear its thin woman cry. He looked up briefly, then called to the young man below him in the coulee bottom. "Deeper," he said. "You got to make it deeper." The man looked up and leaned on his shovel handle briefly and continued to dig. "Hear me?" he said. "I hear you." The younger man was sweating and had thrown aside his jacket, its arms twisted among the brittle stems. He watched the digger assail the dirt ineffectually, then raised his eyes to the broken landscape below him. He liked this place. He had used it before, and that comforted him. It was like a warehouse he knew well and was there when he needed it, quiet and close to town. The dirt was poor, but there were few rocks and the digging was easy. Boys came to this side of the river in the early fall to sight in their rifles for hunting season. The sound of gunfire was not unusual. At the head end of nearly every coulee lay boxes with targets taped to them, and brass shell casings lay about everywhere, as though a series of battles had raged down the ravines and over the low divides and sere hills. Shortly the other man laid aside his shovel and waited, and then the two of them rolled the body in and began covering it over. One with the shovel, the other, the farmer, because he still held the blunt pistol, pushing in the soil with the side of his foot. The wind swept momentarily down into the raw gulch, and the hair on the older man's balding pate stood straight up. The gulls circled, calling into the pale blue sky, where immense banks of cloud raced towards low mountains to the south, bound to the stratosphere by filaments of distant rain. The older man, whose name was John Gload, stooped to pick up a grain sack, which held in its bottom the severed hands and head of the young man whose body they'd just consigned to the thin and unproductive soil of the Missouri River breaks. Anonymous bones now, among others, John Gload's dark signature on the landscape of the world. 200 years earlier, the Pilgrims under Lewis and Clark had portaged around this very ground, trundling their boats in the heat around the impassable falls. Gload, never voluble when he was at work, remembered that bears had once lived here, and the thought made him smile. "Bears," he said, "grizzly bears, right here." The younger man looked at him uncomprehendingly. "Don't give me that look," Gload said. "I'm trying to teach you something. Used to run around here like gophers. 150 years ago, they would have had this asshole dug up and ate before we got over the hill." The older man pointed up the slope where dun cheatgrass sawed about under the March wind. "Imagine their old silvertips a-totter on their hind legs like lethal storybook ogres, sorting out the scent of them. Of course, they might have got us too." He held a small pistol flat in the palm of his hands and considered it. "This goddamn thing wouldn't do nothing but put a little spring in their step while they ripped your head off." Gload surveyed the country around, imagined the hills alive with such beasts. He ran his eyes up and down his partner appraisingly. "You wouldn't make nothing more than a bitty turd pile." They walked then down along the flat coulee bottom, the younger man with the shovel over his shoulder like an infantryman. They stepped among blue stem and sagebrush, bottle shards glistering in the silt like gemstones, and passed without note the stripped bone cages of the poached and butchered deer of the previous fall. That's an excerpt from the first chapter of my novel, The Ploughmen, due out from Picador.